Hey there, welcome to Jet Setting with Jackie. If this is your first time here, welcome. My name is Jackie. And if you're returning, thank you so much for coming back. In this week's video, I will be talking about the process that I went through when I was looking to get a mortgage in Jamaica. If this is of interest to you, stick around for all the details. So I'm going to start this off by saying getting a mortgage in any country, whether it was the US or Jamaica, is not always the easiest task to accomplish, but getting it in Jamaica was a little bit more daunting than it was in the US. There are several reasons why it was a bit more daunting to do it in Jamaica, and I will kind of share what to expect throughout this video and maybe add some things to think about when you're approaching that process. So my mortgage experience started out with a quick conversation I was having with a banker at First Global when I first got to Jamaica, and I was looking to open a bank account. And unfortunately, if you've watched my video about opening a bank account in Jamaica, then you already know that was not successful with First Global. So I didn't end up getting a mortgage with them. So my mortgage process really didn't begin until the end of December, right before the new year. I really decided that 2022 was going to be the year that I purchased my home in Jamaica. So at the very last day of the year, December 31st, I went on NCB's website and I completed my application for a mortgage. Just like most loan application, it really just asks for, your income, your expenses, assets, liability. It was a pretty simple form to complete. So I completed it and it was sent off to the bank right away. About a week and some change went by, and I didn't really hear anything other than the confirmation email that I received. So I reached out to someone at the bank to find out if anyone was going to contact me to start discussing what this process was like. And knowing how things work in Jamaica, I knew it wasn't going to be like a simple, straightforward, to the point type of process. So I wanted to prepare myself. That way I know how long this process was going to take. So after reaching out to them on the 9th, I received an email from them on January 12th, and they were pretty apologetic about, the time that I had to wait and that I would be hearing from someone shortly. Within a couple days, I received a phone call from the person from NCB who ended up sticking with me through this entire process and became my loan officer, who I totally appreciate and love to this day. She moved mountains for me through this process, and I wouldn't have been able to get through this without her. Her name is Latoya Sampson. So if you are ever looking to get a mortgage and you're using NCB as your bank, definitely reach out to her. She made this process much better for me than I'm sure it could have been. So if you need to get a mortgage, just reach out and I will share her contact details. She was awesome throughout this whole process. Our first conversation was pretty brief. It really entailed just understanding what the mortgage process in Jamaica was like, understanding what my needs were, and also her explaining to me what documentation I would need in order to complete the process. She did follow up with an email with a list of all the documentation that we had discussed and what else I would need to send in order to get the application process started. The list included a self-certification of residence documents, which is somewhat of like a tax related document, a consent form in order for her to pull my Jamaican credit history, pay slips for the last 6 months, 12 months worth of bank statements, and a full credit report from one of the 3 bureaus in the US. Of course, you will need to provide similar documentation and it will vary based on where you are currently living or where you will be relocating from. Once all of those documentation were submitted to underwriting, she reached out for additional documents, and in my case it was more so related to rental income. So I have a rental property in the US that generates rental income that is shown on my bank statement, so they wanted me to provide documentation for that. And I also wanted that income to be included in my income. Sounds weird. I wanted to have my rental income included because I wanted it to offset the mortgage on the property in the US, and I also wanted it to minimize my debt to income ratio. Now, if you have a rental property, there are documentation that they do request that you provide to them in order to consider that income. The first thing is, of course, the rental agreement, the last 12 months of the rental receipts. You need to provide proof of ownership of the property. And if for some reason the property is jointly owned, they would want to receive a letter from the other owner to state what portion of that income is yours versus theirs, and also provide all of the bank statements that shows the deposits of that rental income coming in on a monthly basis for the last 24 months. Another thing that was requested was a statement for any outstanding accounts that I had on my credit report. So if I had a credit card or a loan or anything outside of the mortgage, they wanted a statement to show what the payment amount was. So after submitting all of the documentation, including the bank statements, pay stubs, rental agreement documents, credit card statements, by February 14th, my application finally entered the processing stage. By the 23rd of February, I received a phone call from Latoya stating that underwriting needed to verify my employment. Oh boy, here we go again. That was like my thought process, because I know from past experience, especially when I was trying to open my bank account, that verifying my employment is not the easiest task. And of course, I wasn't able to open a Scotiabank account for that very reason. So I was like already thinking, oh man, this is not going to be good. But I went ahead and followed the process that the company that my job uses. Now, this company, they provide me with a verification of employment letter, which I submitted to my loan officer, along with the email address for the company and the phone number for the company. After I submitted my verification of employment, a couple weeks later, I was able to receive my pre-approval letter. And as most people know, in the US, a pre-approval letter doesn't really take that long. It's the most basic of letters that you put together the bank puts together for you using the most basic information. So this is before they get into the nitty-gritty of your income versus expenses. They mainly look at maybe your credit and how much you make quickly and generate a number of what you can afford. So in the US, that typically takes maybe like a day or two to get a pre-approval letter. So for me, while I was going through this process, I know I had reached out to Latoya maybe a month into the process and was like, hey, so where's this letter that I need so that I can start looking for a house? And what she explained to me, I mean, it made total sense. Her thought process was to get all of the information that she needed, get everything into underwriting. That way there's no question about the amount that I can truly afford to get a house in Jamaica. So instead of just giving me a nice fluffy round number, she was actually doing all the legwork up front. That way, when she came to me with a letter, it was actually a real letter of what I could afford. And I'm so appreciative for her for doing that, because that was very eye-opening when I got that letter. It was definitely not what I'd expected, and it led me to a better understanding of the credit history, or I shouldn't call it the credit history, more so how Jamaica views credit versus how the US views credit. And I'll explain all of that in a minute, but that's when it all made sense to me. Before I go any further, let me break down the difference between the credit history that you have in the US versus credit and how it's considered in Jamaica. So in the US, the more open available credit you have, the better your credit score is. So for me, my goal in the US was to have a lot of available credit, long credit history, and keep your ratio below 30%. That is the key in the US. Unfortunately for me, in Jamaica, it's the total opposite. So my first pre-approval letter was pretty eye-opening for me because it took into consideration all of the open credit that I had available in the US. It counted it as debt in a sense. So because it was available to me, they wanted to make sure it was counted in my monthly payment that I could afford. Now, I haven't used some of these credit cards that were on my credit report in maybe 2 to 3 years. But of course, everyone knows in the US, you don't necessarily close your credit cards just because you don't use them, because then that drops your available credit, which if your available credit goes down, then at some point it's going to affect your credit report. So for me in Jamaica, that worked negatively against me. Every single line of credit that I had available to me in the US needed a payment amount assessed to it. And what was happening was, I believe it may have been like 4 or 5% was what the payment amount was that they were using. So when it came time for my pre-approval letter, the amount of debt that was being counted against me was so high that it limited my amount that I would be able to get as a mortgage in Jamaica. So I had to reassess, take a look at the amount of credit that I had available in the US, what accounts I wanted to keep open and operating, and what accounts I would consider closing. That way it would help to increase my credit availability and the amount that I could get in Jamaica for a mortgage. For the cards that I was using, it was easy to get statements that I could provide to show what my monthly payments were. But for the cards that I hadn't used in 2 or 3 years, it wasn't really, it just wasn't really an option for me. So I was advised it was either I would have to close the accounts that I was not using, that way I would reduce my liabilities, or it was just going to have to get counted against me and it would reduce the amount that I would be eligible to borrow. Now, I can totally understand the thought process behind it, because there are people who might have a mortgage in Jamaica and come up here and run up all their credit and have all this debt in the US, but that's not my goal. So even though I understood where the bank was coming from as far as, hey, if this line of credit is open and it's available, we have to consider it as that. But I also think about it like, okay, I can't close all of my US accounts because I have things that I need it for in the US, but I also want to make sure that I have the amount that I needed for a mortgage in Jamaica as well. So that really left me in kind of a peculiar space where I had to sit down and really reassess all of the credit that I had, what I was willing to close and what I wasn't willing to close, in order to get my approval amount increased. On the 18th of March, I notified my loan officer that I had found a property that I was really interested in, and I would be submitting the paperwork to get started on that property. Fortunately for me, it was within the pre-approval amount that I had initially received from her. The only caveat to this was, though, that this was an unfinished property, so I needed to understand how that would affect my mortgage process. Since this is a mortgage video, I'm not going to get into this property too much because there is definitely a story to come about this property. I will focus on the mortgage process in this video and save this particular story for another video. There was a lot of lessons that I learned from that first house that I found and what that process was like. I'll be ready to share that experience in the next video about looking for real estate in Jamaica. Regardless of the outcome of that specific property, I did follow the necessary steps when it came to getting a mortgage on a property in Jamaica. So the first steps that I had to take was I had to submit my paperwork to the bank so that they could start the process of determining if that is a property that they would be willing to finance. Some of the things that I had to provide to them, especially since this was an unfinished property, was an estimate of what it would cost to complete the property from a contractor. That way the bank would know what amount I would need outside of the mortgage in order to get the house completely done. Also, because it was an unfinished property, they needed to make sure that the property was, I believe, 80 or 85% complete. I also needed to provide a valuation report and a surveyor's report. Once all of the items were completed and submitted to the bank, she was able to pass them off to underwriting so that they can begin the process of determining if that is a property that they would finance for me. Now, I can only assume that underwriting is similar to what it is in the US, where the underwriter gets all of the documentation, they review them to make sure they're completed and that they're accurate, and then they review the collateral that's being provided to them to determine if that's something that the bank wants to take on. And then I'm assuming there's probably some sort of risk-based approach as to whether they should give you the money for this property or not to give you the money for this property. But again, I'm not an underwriter, so I don't even know if that's exactly how this process works. But I'm assuming that that's a general thought about how it goes. Due to unforeseen circumstances between the owner of the property and her tenant, I was not able to move forward with the sale of that property. In the middle of all of the process, everything basically came to a screeching halt. And that's where I would say I learned another costly lesson living in Jamaica. After all of this happened with that property, it really made me sit down and try to reassess what I really wanted to do as far as living in Jamaica. I actually started rethinking, do I just continue to rent for a while? Do I spend less time in Jamaica and more time in the US? I was really going back and forth on that decision because I just felt like I'm doing all of these things and it's costing me so much money, and it was just so much. Like, I just went through a crazy situation back in October with a landlord, and then I came to this other situation of trying to purchase a house, and that was a lot of a headache again. So I just kind of wanted to take a break from even looking at any more properties or even purchasing at that point, and maybe just go back to the US for a little bit. That thought process only lasted about 2 weeks. I mean, it was a fleeting thought, guys. It came and then it left. I continued on with my mortgage process. I still kept submitting all the paperwork Latoya requested. And just so you know, as time progresses, while you're in this process, you're going to have to keep providing updated documentation. So along the way, I was constantly sending updated bank statements, updated pay stubs, anything that would be outdated, you would need to update them. So at this point, it was probably around April. So I started doing this back in January, February. So 3 months worth of bank statements was about to be outdated. So I was providing her with updated information along the way. At the same time, while I'm providing documentation to her, and I was thinking about putting a pause on looking for a house in Jamaica, I had a conversation with one of my cousins, and I was basically telling her like, hey, you know, maybe I'll just come back to Florida and spend a lot more time in Florida, maybe come to Jamaica for maybe a month or two at a time and go back and forth that way. And you know, we were entertaining that thought for, like I said, about a week or two. And then out of nowhere, and I promise I was not even looking for a house at this point. I just happened to be looking in the newspaper, and I'm not even sure how I ended up in the real estate section, because I've never looked for property in, say, I think it might have been the Observer that I was looking at. I think I was reading a news story and went to their webpage and just happened up on their real estate page. And that is where I found the listing for the house that I currently live in and that I currently own. So it was off the whim, never looked there for properties, and bam, this house showed up. It was hi guys, in the middle of that my battery just died, so let's start over. I don't even remember where I stopped. That process in finding my current home that I'm living in, I will discuss in more detail in the Finding Real Estate in Jamaica video. Thanks to Latoya, my loan officer, by the time I found this house, I was already deep into my mortgage process. I'd already gotten my first pre-approval, and I had also got a reassessed pre-approval after I closed out some of my US credit accounts that I was not using. So I had an updated pre-approval letter, and I was ready to go when I found this property. All I had to do at this point was provide the documentation for this house. So similarly to the house that I mentioned earlier, I had to provide the surveyor's report. I also had to provide an appraisal on the property, and of course the signed contract for the house. I don't think it took a full week before Latoya was able to put together what my loan options would be for that property. Since this was a completed home, there was nothing to worry about as far as getting any estimates or anything like that. It was literally just a pretty straightforward deal. This is how much the house cost. Let me see what my options were. So I was presented with 3 different options. The first option was 90% financing with a commitment fee of 2% of out-of-pocket expense, and no life insurance was required. The second option was 90% financing with life insurance and a commitment fee of about 2% out of pocket. My third option was 90% financing with a 3.5% commitment fee and no life insurance required. It's not typical in the US for the banks to require you to have life insurance when you take out a mortgage, or at least for me, that's never been something that I was asked about or asked to do. But in Jamaica, that's actually a thing. Like, certain mortgages require you to have life insurance. And of course, we all know why. They want to make sure that if something happens to you, that they get their money. Ultimately, it's up to you to choose whatever options is presented to you and what makes the most sense. And of course, I reviewed all of the 3 options that were presented to me. And I know I had several questions about certain things that doesn't didn't really make sense to me, or I shouldn't say it didn't make sense. More so, I didn't understand what they were, and I needed an explanation of what I was looking at and how that factors into the cost of the mortgage. And Latoya was super helpful anytime I had any questions about what was going on with my loan, or what does this mean, and can you explain what these packages are and what these fees are. She was always ready and willing and able to explain all of that to me. The mortgage on this house, that process started in June of last year, and by November we had everything completed, where title work was already registered and everything was completed. Funds had changed hands and mortgage was done. So overall, it was that June, you don't count June, so July, August, September, October, and it was completed in November. So roughly 4.5-ish months it took to complete the mortgage process for this house. I think that had a lot to do with the fact that I had already been working on the mortgage process, so I was way ahead of the game when I needed the process to really begin on the second house. Now, does that mean that yours will take 4.5 months? Probably not. It could take less, but knowing how things move in Jamaica, I would say expect something similar, or possibly longer, depending on what the process is for that specific property and for you specifically. Everyone's situation is so different that it's kind of hard to put a time on it. There are some things that you should think about when you are looking to get a mortgage in Jamaica. Something that I don't think is big in the US but is your age is a big factor. So in Jamaica, the younger you are, the more time you have to pay your mortgage off. So the retirement age in Jamaica is 70 if you are a regular employee of a company, and 75 if you are self-employed. So your mortgage depends on how old you are and how many years you have up until retirement age. If you are closer to 70, then the number of years that you would have to pay off your mortgage is significantly lower, which means that that could affect the amount that you are allowed to borrow as a mortgage. Unless, of course, your payment is what you can afford based on your income or whatever assets you have to use towards that payment. So definitely think about that when you are determining if a mortgage is right for you. Another thing to think about, which didn't necessarily apply to me, is getting NHT funding. Now, I did not contribute to NHT. Oh, and NHT is basically something that you contribute to when you are an employee or if you're self-employed, and it's also something that you can pay into. Say you want to voluntarily do it, that way you will have the funds that will be available for you in the future. It's not something that I did because obviously I was living overseas until 2021, so I was never really contributing into NHT, and I didn't even realize that that was something that I could do until I went back to Jamaica and found out what the stipulations were. So if that's something that you're interested in, NHT is available, National Housing Trust. They do allow you to contribute a certain portion of your income, and you can ultimately go back to them when you're ready to purchase a property or land, or you're looking to build on a property that you already own. They will allow you to borrow funds through them at a lower interest rate. Of course, I don't know all the details about NHT because that's not something that I used, but just a little bit of quick information about NHT. They do allow each borrower to borrow up to 7.5 million Jamaican dollars, and that's an increase of $1 million starting on July 1st of 2023. So each Jamaican that has contributed to NHT will be allowed to borrow up to $7.5 million. To qualify to borrow from NHT, you have to be a current contributor and you have to have contributed within the last 52 weeks. If you're self-employed, you have to have paid up with interest any outstanding contribution dues. You also have to be between the age of 18 and 70, and you have to have some sort of income that will allow you to repay the loan. With the NHT loan, they are a government program, and the loan interest is much lower than what you would if you went just through a bank. If you're interested in using an NHT loan, the minimum amount of time that you have to contribute is 2 years. So you have to make at least 104 payments into NHT before you can apply for that benefit. If you are overseas now and would like to start contributing to NHT so that you can have that benefit when it's time to apply for your mortgage, there is a voluntary contributors form that you can fill out. That way you can send the payments when they are due. Now, whether or not it's beneficial to go through NHT or just get a regular mortgage will definitely be up to you and what your circumstances are. But in my case, I had not contributed to NHT and therefore I couldn't use that as a possible way of financing. But if this is something that you plan to do, say 2 to 3 years down the line, and you believe NHT might be beneficial for you and you're overseas, or even if you're in Jamaica, it's probably a good idea to contribute. Or if not, just check it out and see if it's something that is of interest to you. Also, if you are coming from the US and looking to purchase in Jamaica, credit is a big thing. Like I mentioned earlier in this video, if you have a lot of open credit in the US, even though it's not being used, it will count against you in Jamaica. So be prepared for that. Me, I ended up closing maybe 4 store cards, I believe it was. It was cards that I wasn't really using, like Home Depot and like a Victoria's Secret account or something like that. Just things that were just there boosting the availability that I had, which was great for me in the US, but was negatively working against me in Jamaica. So that's something else to think about that you don't have to worry about in the US. Even though I ended up sticking with NCB through this entire process, I did reach out to Victoria Mutual back in, I want to say, March, and I will say the turnaround time for their pre-approval letter was very quick. I believe it was like done within like the next day or the day after. So when it comes to their pre-approval letters, they were quick, and I really appreciated that. But something to keep in mind is they do not consider rental income as income with Victoria Mutual, which for me, that's important because I need that to offset my mortgage that's in the US. When I spoke to them, they said that that is something that they were looking to change in the future. So I don't know if that has happened as yet, but get with it, Victoria Mutual. Rental income is income. You don't count the full amount, but you should count some of it. Another thing to keep in mind, you will have to provide a lot of documentation. Those bank statements, pay stubs, credit reports, you might have to provide them multiple times depending on how long your loan process is. For me, it started basically in January when I first started speaking with Latoya. And when I finally found the property that I was going to move forward with was June. So that's a 6-month gap, which means you're going to have to provide documentation at least every 3 months just to stay up to date. The same with your credit report. Whenever you provide bank statements or pay stubs, most likely they're going to require that you provide your credit report. And everyone knows, or if you don't know, in the US, you do get access to a free credit report every single year. Since there's 3 bureaus, you can have one of each. So if you want to use that free credit report every 3 months, that's a good idea. You can split it up, and then the first 3 months you send Equifax, the next month you send the next 3 months you send your Experian. As long as they have a credit report that they can use, you'll be fine. Fortunately for me, I did not have to pay for the credit reports that I sent to them. So if you have the benefit, you can do that. I do have Experian, which I think it's free. So I was able to pull my Experian report and send it to them. And I also, I believe, used the free annual credit report for one of those specific times and sent one from there as well from another bureau. Can't remember which one. You'll have to keep up with your documentation that you're providing to your loan officer, and hopefully you have a really good one that works for you, because again, there were things that needed verification, like my employment, and Latoya definitely did everything she could to make sure that happened, because for me that is not the easiest process. Not sure why it's such a big deal to verify my employment, but she made it happen. And when it came to the credit cards and trying to get the 4 to 5% down, she, told me what I needed to do. And yes, it was a little bit of work on my end, but I was willing to do it. And what I did was I went to each of my credit card companies and pulled my agreement to see what the percentage is that, even though I don't have a payment, what that percentage would be. Instead of them using their rounded off 4 or 5%, it actually told me exactly what my payment would be based on my agreement with a credit card company, and they were able to use that. So if you are in the same boat as I was, where you have a lot of open credit that you're not using, that's another avenue that you can explore. But again, you would have to have a loan officer that's willing to, do the work to go to underwriting and explain, hey, this is what's going on with my client, and this is what I have to back it up. So find you a good loan officer. If you want more information about this process, or if you're interested in knowing who I worked with, I will willingly share that information with you. Now, another thing before I move on from this topic, the whole real estate issue in Jamaica. I do plan to do a video on what my thoughts are about the affordability of homes in Jamaica. Yes, I am fortunate enough to be able to afford a nice home, but I also have a nice job that affords me the ability to do that. Now, at the rate that real estate is going in Jamaica, it definitely priced a lot of Jamaicans out of the market. Now, I'll do a bit more research before I complete an entire video on this topic, but it's definitely something that has crossed my mind several times while I was looking for real estate. Just looking at the properties that were out there, the cost of those properties, thinking about how that mortgage process was, and what a regular Jamaican person who works there and live there, and this is all they have available. It's definitely a tough market out there. But that's a video that's to come, but wanted to throw that out there before I signed off on this one. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and hopefully it provided you with some insight as to what the mortgage process in Jamaica is like. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, or you can reach out to me via email as well. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, bye.